she joked. He heard, and suddenly 3 years of silence meant nothing. It was just a comment, a silly throwaway line whispered after hours, never meant for anyone's ears, especially not his, but he heard it. And from that moment on, something between them changed. Imagine this. You've spent years working beside someone, admiring them quietly, and one day they find out. Not because you told them, but because someone else did. What would you do when the truth you never meant to reveal is suddenly out in the open? This is the story of a woman who didn't mean to be seen, and a man who couldn't look away once he did. If you've ever loved in silence, if you've ever wished someone knew, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your story. Now, come with us to the moment where everything begins with one sentence she never meant for him to hear. Have you ever said something you thought no one heard and then wished you could take it back? Sarah Whitmore had always been careful with words. She measured them like teaspoons of sugar, never too much, never too little. In a world where everything could be misread, misquoted, and misunderstood, silence had often felt like her safest language. But that day, she slipped. It was a late Thursday afternoon in Denver. The office had begun to empty. The once busy corridors now held only echoes of footsteps and the faint scent of reheated coffee. Sarah was finishing up reports in the executive wing of Langston Media Group when Madison popped her head into the doorway. "Want to stretch a little? Kitchen's empty." Sarah nodded, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. A break sounded good. Her back ached from hours at the desk, and her mind was foggy from numbers and names. The break room was dimly lit, warm with the low hum of the refrigerator. Madison poured herself a cup of lukewarm tea, then turned with a mischievous smirk. "You were a machine in that meeting today," she said. "You didn't even flinch when Richard shot down Brian's entire pitch." Sarah smiled faintly, brushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Composure is a survival skill," she replied. Madison leaned against the counter, her grin widening. He looked at you differently. You know, like he was impressed or intrigued. Sarah rolled her eyes, the corners of her mouth twitching. "Don't read into it. That's just how he looks at the quarterly projections." And then it came. The line. The one that wasn't meant for anyone else's ears. If he ever smiled at me like that, I'd probably forget my name. She said it without thinking. No filter, no plan, just a flicker of vulnerability dressed up as humor. Madison chuckled. The moment passed, or so Sarah thought. The next morning, the office buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Emails flying, phones ringing, printers humming like tired bees. Sarah arrived early, as always. She liked the quiet before the noise, liked the way the morning sun hit her desk through the tall windows. It made the world feel manageable for a little while. By 9:00 a.m., the executive team was seated for their weekly strategy meeting. Richard Langston sat at the head of the table, tailored suit immaculate, expression unreadable as ever. He was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. Sarah stood off to the side, her leather-bound notebook in hand, pen poised. She was ready to take notes, interject where needed, keep things moving. What she wasn't ready for was the sideways glance. It came just as Madison entered the room, slightly late, cheeks flushed. Richard's eyes followed her for half a second, and then drifted, deliberately, to Sarah, a beat too long. And then the meeting began. At first, Sarah convinced herself she imagined it, that the glance meant nothing. But then Madison leaned over during the break, whispering with eyes wide, I didn't know he was in earshot yesterday. Sarah's stomach dropped. What? The break room? He must have been near the hall. I mentioned what you said. Everyone laughed. Even he smirked. But yeah, he heard it. Sarah felt the color drain from her face. She managed a polite nod, excused herself for some water, and stood frozen at the edge of the corridor, heart pounding like a faulty engine. 3 years, 3 whole years she'd kept herself in check. She had walked the careful line between efficient and invisible, never allowing the slightest slip. Because falling for your boss, especially one like Richard Langston, was a mistake with a long shelf life. And now a single sentence had undone all her quiet discipline. For the rest of the day, Sarah moved through the office like someone sleepwalking. She smiled at meetings, nodded at clients, replied to emails, but all through a haze. Every time Richard walked by, every time she heard his voice across the floor, her skin prickled with embarrassment. Had he laughed? Was he offended? Did he care? That night, back in her small one-bedroom apartment near City Park. Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, still in work clothes, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Not out of vanity, but out of curiosity. What did he see when he looked at her, a competent assistant, a forgettable cog in the machine? Or had he looked longer because he'd seen something more? She shook her head, laughed at herself softly. "This is exactly why I don't speak freely," she murmured, but deep inside, under the layers of embarrassment and anxiety, another feeling began to stir, something quieter, something warmer, something hopeful. The next morning, as Sarah stepped into the elevator at Langston Media, she felt it again. The weight of his eyes, not heavy, not inappropriate, just intentional. She didn't dare meet them, but she knew. He had heard, and he hadn't forgotten. Sometimes it's not what they say, it's how long they look. And lately, Richard Langston had been looking at Sarah Whitmore just a moment too long. Not in an obvious way, not the kind of gaze that made people uncomfortable or drew whispers, but quiet, focused, like someone trying to read a sentence already memorized, yet finding a new meaning in it every time. Sarah first noticed it 3 days after the comment. She had just stepped into his office, a steaming cup of dark roast in one hand, his schedule in the other. She was dressed, as always, in crisp neutrals, simple slacks, a pale blouse, minimal makeup, practical, predictable, safe. "Morning," she said softly. He looked up from his laptop, pen resting between his fingers. His gaze met hers and lingered, not on the coffee, not on the planner, on her, just long enough for her pulse to skip. That look repeated itself, again and again over the next week, at meetings, in the elevator, even through the glass walls of his office when he thought she wasn't looking. It wasn't intrusive. There was no smirk, no sly grin, no invitation, just awareness, as if he saw her more clearly now, or perhaps had always seen her, but only now allowed himself to show it. Sarah didn't know how to respond. Part of her was flattered. Another part wanted to shrink, to fade into the beige walls and careful lines of professionalism she'd spent years constructing. She replayed the moment in her mind too often. That sentence, that foolish, fleeting sentence. If he ever smiled at me like that, I'd probably forget my name. Now, it felt like a key that had unlocked something between them. A small crack in the polished surface of office formality, one that widened a little more each day. On Friday, she found herself brushing her hair a little longer before work, choosing a blouse with softer lines, applying a dab of perfume she hadn't touched in months. Not for him, at least that's what she told herself. By noon, she regretted the perfume. Every time he walked past her desk, She wondered if he noticed it. Worse, she wondered if she wanted him to. That afternoon, while reviewing logistics for an upcoming client summit, Richard's voice came through her intercom. "Sarah, can you step in for a moment?" She straightened her skirt and smoothed her expression. Composed, collected, always. He was standing by the window when she entered, back to her. Denver's cityscape spread out behind him like a still painting. "I'd like you to attend the gala next Saturday," he said without turning. Sarah blinked. The fundraising gala for Westbridge Foundation. He nodded once, then turned to face her. "We're sponsoring this year. The board expects a strong showing."
"I'll need you there to coordinate details on site." There was no smile, no hint of mischief, just his usual even tone. But something about the request didn't feel usual at all. Richard had never taken an assistant to a social event, at least not in the 3 years Sarah had worked for him. He managed logistics on his own or delegated to project managers. Never her. "Of course," she replied carefully. "Formal attire." He gave a small nod, his gaze resting on her just a second longer than necessary. Black tie. Back at her desk, Sarah sat motionless for nearly 5 minutes. This was work, strictly professional. It had to be. And yet, her mind wandered to what he would wear, to how he might look in a tuxedo, to whether he would glance at her across a crowded room the same way he had been lately from behind a glass wall, or across a conference table. Would he linger? Would he smile? Or would it all mean nothing, another carefully executed evening in a carefully built world that night, as she curled up on her couch with a half-read book and untouched tea? Sarah let the quiet press in. She was good at reading people. It was one of the reasons she had kept this job longer than most. But Richard Langston wasn't like most people. He was hard to read, harder to reach. And yet, something had shifted. Not in what he said, but in the way he saw her, and if she wasn't careful, she might start seeing him too. Not as her boss, not as the man behind the spreadsheets and strategy sessions, but as someone who, behind all that control, just might be searching for something he didn't yet have words for. A small part of her, a part long buried under routine and caution, wondered, was he testing her? Or was he finally stepping closer? It wasn't a date, but it didn't feel like work either. The gala had ended over an hour ago, but Sarah's pulse hadn't quite settled. She stood outside the glass doors of the Westbridge ballroom, holding a soft clutch in one hand and trying to keep her breath even. Around her, Denver glowed under the early autumn sky, street lamps flickering, cars humming past like lullabies. Behind her, Richard was finishing a quiet conversation with the charity's director. His voice, deep, calm, carried just enough to remind her he was still near. Too near. The night had been smooth. Too smooth. He hadn't made a single offhand remark, hadn't looked at her too long, or said anything that might give her mind an excuse to wander. And yet her thoughts did just that. All evening she had felt him watching her, not in a way that pierced, but in a way that warmed, like sitting close to a fireplace not being touched, but knowing the heat is there. She glanced down at her dress, a midnight blue silk gown with a modest neckline and cap sleeves. She had worn it before, to a cousin's wedding, but tonight it felt different on her. She felt different. Not an assistant, not a background figure, not invisible, just a woman, next to a man who had stopped being just her boss weeks ago. "Dinner." Richard's voice came behind her, quiet and low. She turned. He was standing close, adjusting his cufflinks, the tuxedo fitting him like second skin. There was no urgency in his tone, no implication, just the offer. Soft, steady, and oddly vulnerable. Sarah hesitated only for a second. "Okay," she replied. They ended up at a restaurant tucked into a quiet corner of downtown. One of those places without a sign, just a door, soft lights, and the smell of rosemary and firewood. The kind of place where people went to talk, or not talk. They were seated near the back, beside a window that framed the city skyline like a moving painting. A bottle of wine was opened. Menus arrived, were glanced at, then folded again. For the first several minutes, they barely spoke. And strangely, it wasn't awkward. There was something oddly comforting in the silence between them, as if both of them had grown tired of filling space with unnecessary words. Richard swirled the wine in his glass, then set it down gently. "Thank you for tonight," he said. Sarah looked up. "It was your event," she replied softly, lips curving. "I was just coordinating." He gave her a look, half amused, half something else. "You were more than that." A pause. "Then you made things feel lighter." Sarah didn't quite know what to say to that, so she smiled and let the wine sit on her tongue a moment longer. The main course arrived. She had chosen something simple, grilled salmon, sautéed greens. He had ordered steak, rare, with root vegetables and a glass of Malbec to pair. As the dishes were cleared, the air between them shifted slightly, still quiet, but heavier now. As if something had been circling the edges of the conversation, waiting to land. "It's been a while since I've been to one of these," he said at last, voice quieter now. She tilted her head, curious. "The gala," he nodded. "My wife used to drag me to them." Sarah's breath caught, just a little. She had heard whispers around the office, a photo once glimpsed on his desk, long since removed, but he had never mentioned her. Not until now. "She passed 5 years ago," he added. No elaboration, no dramatics, just a fact, stated like weather. Sarah folded her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, appreciative, but distant. A beat. "I was engaged once," she offered. 5 years ago, too. His eyes met hers, just for a moment, not with surprise, more like recognition. "What happened?" She shrugged, lips tightening. He changed his mind, said he wasn't ready. Then, after a breath, "I guess I wasn't either." Their wine glasses touched again gently this time, not in celebration, but in understanding. Minutes passed. The music from the speakers, a soft jazz piano, filled the space. They didn't. And then he spoke again, low, barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I looked at someone this way." Her eyes lifted slowly. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't hiding, either. Sarah felt the warmth rise up her neck, not blush something deeper, like a door opening just a crack. She held his gaze, then looked away. Not because she was afraid, because she didn't trust herself not to hope. When they stepped back into the night, the air had cooled. Autumn was arriving early this year. He offered her his jacket. She declined, but when their hands brushed as he opened the car door, neither of them pulled away right away. It wasn't a date, but it didn't feel like work either. And as she sat silently in the passenger seat, watching Denver's lights blur past the window, Sarah wondered, was she stepping into something real, or something too fragile to name? She wrote it not to send, but to understand herself. It began with her favorite pen, a soft gold fountain pen, smooth against the paper, the kind that made even the smallest thoughts feel significant. She had used it for grocery lists, notes to clients, the occasional poem scribbled in the quiet moments between work and sleep. But tonight, she used it to write something else, something she didn't plan to show anyone, especially not him. "Dear Richard, you'll never read this, and maybe that's the only reason I can write it." She sat at the kitchen table, the only light in the apartment coming from the overhead bulb that buzzed faintly when the wind howled outside. The city had gone to sleep, but her mind hadn't. There are things I can't say out loud, because once spoken, they become real. And I'm not ready for that kind of truth. Not when it feels like everything I know could shift under my feet. She paused, fingers tightening around the pen. The night had been quiet, too quiet. She had spent it listening to voicemails from her sister back east, updates on their mother. Olivia's health was declining. The doctors were recommending long-term treatment in New York. Expenses, specialists, decisions that couldn't wait. It wasn't unexpected, but somehow it still felt like the floor had cracked beneath her. Sarah had always been the steady one, the daughter who stayed close, stayed working, stayed silent. But now everything was pressing in. And Richard, he had become part of that pressure, or maybe part of the ache. You once said you hadn't looked at someone that way in a long time. Do you know what it did to me? It scared me. Richard, but not for the reasons you might think. It scared me because I'd been looking at you that way for much longer. She closed her eyes, breathed in deep. The wine glass beside her sat half full, cold now. The letter was half written, pages creased slightly under her palm. Part of her wanted to tear it up. The other part kept writing. I'm not a woman who expects fairy tales. I've lived too long to believe in grand gestures or flawless men. But I do believe in quiet kindness, in the weight of a glance that lingers just a little too long, in the way silence can sometimes speak louder than words. And lately, that's all I seem to feel when I'm near you. The apartment creaked. Outside, wind scraped against the windows. She stood, stretched her shoulders, poured out the wine. When she returned to the table, she folded the pages carefully, pressed them between the cover of an old novel one she knew no one would think to open. She didn't write love, Sarah. She didn't sign it at all, because it wasn't a love letter. Not really. It was a confession. To herself. The next morning, she made a decision. She would leave Langston Media Group. Not immediately, not without care. She had one final project, an acquisition she'd helped build from the ground up. Once it closed, she would hand in her resignation. No fanfare, no explanations. She would move to New York to help care for her mother. Start fresh, if such a thing was possible at 34. It was the right thing to do. But it didn't feel right. Not yet. She didn't tell anyone. Not Madison. Not the HR director who had been dropping hints about a promotion, and certainly not Richard. She couldn't. Because if she told him, she was afraid she wouldn't leave. That afternoon, she stood by the copier in the main hallway, watching the machine spit out final reports. From across the floor, Richard walked past. He wasn't looking her way, but she knew the rhythm of his steps too well to mistake him. She glanced up. And in that moment, through the glass wall of his office, she saw him stop, just briefly. He turned his head. Their eyes met. Not for long, not deeply, but enough. Enough to freeze her breath in her throat. It was the first time she didn't feel flattered by his gaze, or embarrassed, or confused. She felt afraid, not of him, but of what she was about to walk away from. What if this was something real? What if this was the one time in her life she was supposed to risk everything? And what if she was too scared to even try? She turned away before the copier finished its job, went back to her desk, opened her email, typed a draft of her 2 weeks' notice. Then, after staring at it for 5 full minutes, she clicked Save as Draft. The letter in the book remained untouched, unread, unsent, unspoken, just like so many other things between them. He wasn't used to waiting for anyone, but that day, he did.
The meeting had run over, as they always seem to on Thursdays. 3 hours of spreadsheets, forecasts, and corporate lingo that droned like static in Sarah's ears. She'd smiled when expected, spoken when prompted, taken notes with the same practiced elegance she'd honed over the years. But inside, her mind was miles away. Back in New York, her mother was awaiting treatment plans. Her resignation letter still sat in her drafts, untouched, and the memory of a folded letter hidden between pages of an old novel rested heavy in her chest. She hadn't looked at Richard once during the meeting. Couldn't, because lately looking at him felt like stepping too close to something she couldn't afford to want. It was late afternoon when she finally packed up her bag. The office had thinned. The air outside had thickened. Denver's skies, usually so crisp and golden in the fall, had turned a dull slate gray. And as she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed with a weather alert. Rain expected. Heavy. Of course, she didn't have an umbrella. She rarely did. It was Colorado, not Seattle. Sarah sighed, tucked her bag under her arm, and braced herself. The parking garage hummed low and steady, fluorescent lights flickering against the damp concrete. She moved quickly, heels echoing against the walls. And then she saw him, leaning against her car, hands in the pockets of his long black coat, hair slightly damp at the edges. No assistant, no phone in hand, no reason to be there. Just Richard, waiting. She slowed. "You're going to get wet," she said, voice softer than she intended. He looked up and smiled. "Just wanted to see if you'd come out smiling today." It wasn't a line. It didn't land like one, more like an offering, or maybe a question wrapped in casual words. Sarah blinked. "That's not part of your job description," she murmured, trying to smile back. He shrugged. "I've been revising the fine print." The rain began. Not a drizzle, but real rain. Fat, heavy drops that echoed through the garage roof and scattered across the pavement like coins. Neither of them moved. He didn't reach for her door, didn't make a gesture. Just stood there like he had all the time in the world. And for a man like Richard Langston, that meant something. He hated inefficiency, loathed wasted minutes. But here he was, drenched in soft gray rain, waiting. For her. Sarah's hand tightened around her keys. Part of her wanted to laugh, part of her wanted to cry. Instead, she unlocked the car, slid into the driver's seat, and stared straight ahead. The engine hummed softly beneath her, wipers sweeping away the storm in rhythmic arcs. He walked around to the passenger side. She didn't stop him. The door closed with a soft click. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was rain. Against the windshield. Against the roof. Against everything that had felt safe and quiet before. Sarah's fingers curled around the steering wheel, knuckles pale. "What are you doing?" "Richard?" she asked finally. His answer came slow. "I don't know." A pause. "I just didn't want you walking out into the storm alone. That shouldn't have meant anything. It shouldn't have sent warmth spreading through her chest, shouldn't have made her want to reach across the center console and place her hand over his. But it did. Because it wasn't the grand things that undid Sarah. It was the simple ones, the ordinary mercies. A man waiting in the rain. A voice asking if she was smiling. And suddenly, the walls she'd built so carefully started to tremble. She let out a small laugh, not loud, not sharp, just enough to break the silence. "You always do that," she said. He tilted his head. "Do what? Say the exact thing I didn't know I needed to hear." He didn't respond, didn't need to, because in that moment, it wasn't about answers. It was about presence.
about staying in the rain when it would have been easier to leave. A long pause stretched between them, not awkward, just full. And Sarah, who had spent years hiding in logic and schedules, found herself wanting to say something irrational, like, "Don't go," like, "Stay longer." But instead, she just looked forward, watching the wipers clear the windshield. The city beyond was blurred, softened by water and dusk. She didn't drive, didn't speak, just sat there, the air warm and heavy inside the car, her hand still on the wheel, his breath barely audible beside her, and somewhere, deep inside her chest, something cracked, not shattered, not collapsed, just cracked. And through that crack, something real began to seep in. Some people leave without saying goodbye. Others leave without explaining why. Sarah had never been good at goodbyes. Not the real kind. The kind that left you aching for words that arrived too late or never at all. She had spent the entire weekend packing, not boxes, not yet, but her mind, sorting through logistics, transferring accounts, making arrangements with HR for remote work, preparing to say less than she felt and do more than she could explain. Her mother's treatments would begin soon. New York was waiting, and even if the decision had been made out of love, it didn't make the leaving easier, especially not with Richard, because he didn't know. Not yet. And every day that passed without her saying it made her feel like a thief stealing time that didn't really belong to her. She would tell him next week. That's what she kept promising herself. Just one more week. Let the project close. Let things end cleanly. But endings are never clean when your heart is involved. Tuesday afternoon. She was deep in reports when her phone buzzed. A message. Simple. From Richard. Dinner. Friday night?
Just as a thank you. She stared at the screen. Just as a thank you. Not a date, not a farewell, not anything that required interpretation, and yet it made her chest tighten. She typed back, "Sure. 7. Friday came slowly. The hours dragged with unusual weight. She answered emails with careful detachment, avoided Richard's office, avoided mirrors, because she wasn't ready to see herself, not tonight, not when the truth sat so heavily just beneath her skin. The restaurant was quieter this time, smaller, cozier, tucked behind a flower shop on 8th Avenue. Dim lighting, a single candle flickering between them, soft piano drifting through the air like a lullaby for grown-up hearts. Sarah wore a dark green dress, not new, but it felt different on her, more final. Richard arrived on time, of course, always precise, always composed. He looked tired, but in a kind way, like someone who had been carrying more than he let on. They ordered light. Shared a bottle of wine, talked about work, about clients, about the things people talk about when neither wants to touch what's really there. But halfway through dessert, the mood shifted. He set down his spoon, looked at her, really looked. Then, with a faint smile, "Did you really say, 'I make you forget your name'?" Time froze. Sarah blinked, breath catching. He wasn't teasing. His voice was low, gentle, not mocking, not arrogant, just curious. She stared at him for a long moment, then let out a soft, startled laugh. A sound caught between disbelief and surrender. "I think I did." Her voice cracked slightly, and before she could stop it, the tears came, not sobs, not dramatic, just two quiet trails down her cheeks that glistened in the candlelight. Richard didn't speak, didn't look away. And somehow that made it worse. Because this man she'd admired in silence, feared too much to touch, was now sitting across from her, waiting for something she didn't know how to give. "I wasn't supposed to feel this," she said softly. He tilted his head. This. She nodded. This ache. This wish that I could freeze time, or rewind it. She wiped her cheek. I'm leaving. Richard. He didn't move. New York. She added. My mom. Her treatment starts next month. I'm going to work remote for a while. Then, I don't know. Still, he said nothing. The silence was thick, not uncomfortable, but weighted like snow falling too early in the season. Finally, he leaned forward, his hands rested on the table, fingers interlaced. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She looked at him, really looked, because she didn't want to lie. I didn't want it to change anything. A pause. I didn't want to hope. Their eyes locked. And in that quiet, Sarah saw everything she hadn't dared imagine longing. Fear, regret, and something softer, something that looked like stay. But she couldn't. Not yet. Because sometimes the right love came at the wrong time, and sometimes you had to leave to know what you truly wanted. They sat like that for a long while. No more questions, no more confessions, just two people, on the edge of something beautiful or tragic, or maybe both. When the check came, he reached for it. She didn't stop him. As they stood outside beneath the cool night sky, he opened her door. She paused before getting in, looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, smiled without hiding. I did say it, she whispered, then, almost like a joke, and honestly, I still forget my name sometimes. He smiled back, didn't speak, didn't have to. As she pulled away, Sarah glanced once in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, hands in pockets, waiting. And somehow that made it even harder to go. I didn't mean for you to hear it, but maybe I did. The words were already forming inside Sarah's chest before she even sat down. The restaurant was smaller this time, more intimate. A quiet Italian place. Richard had chosen dim lights, brick walls, small tables meant for quiet conversation, the kind of place people went when silence mattered more than sound. Sarah wore navy, no jewelry. Her hair was pulled back, not out of effort but because she didn't want anything to distract her. Not tonight. She was leaving. And there were things she needed to say before she did. They talked about the usual things at first, the client proposal, a supplier hiccup, Denver's cold snap. Richard was attentive, steady, but not quite relaxed. There was something different in the way his eyes moved, less guarded, more careful. He sensed it. She could tell. The way he sipped his wine slower. The way he asked questions but didn't press too hard. It was as if he, too, was walking on the edge of something, unsure whether to leap or hold back. Halfway through the meal, Sarah set her fork down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I've been meaning to tell you something. His eyes lifted to hers. She exhaled slowly. My mother. She's starting treatment next week. A pause. In New York. He nodded, gently. I know that's why you've been remote. She looked down. There's more. The candle flickered. Outside. Rain traced tiny rivers down the window pane. Inside. Time slowed. I'm not coming back, she said softly. I mean, not to the office. Not to Denver. Not like before. There was a stillness then. Not cold. Not unkind. Just suspended. Richard sat back slightly, as if the air had pushed against him. I see, he said after a while. She swallowed. I didn't want to make it dramatic. I just needed space to say it. Another pause. He reached for his glass, then changed his mind. So,
he began, voice low. "Is this goodbye?" Sarah looked at him. Her breath trembled in her chest. She wanted to say no. She wanted to say, "Not yet." She wanted to say, "Stay." But the words wouldn't come, not the way she wanted. So instead, she stood, folded her napkin gently, slid her chair back with careful grace, and placed something on the table between them. A folded letter, yellowed slightly at the edges, its crease well worn from months of hiding. Richard looked down, then back at her. "You don't have to, I do," she said, softly cutting him off. "I wrote it a long time ago. I never sent it because I wasn't ready. I didn't even know what I meant when I wrote it." She stepped back, her coat draped over her arm, her purse clutched close to her side. "But I think, maybe now I do." She turned before he could stop her, walked through the narrow hallway, past flickering wall sconces and soft murmurs from other tables. The door opened with a quiet chime. And then she was gone. Richard stared at the envelope for a long while. The restaurant around him had faded into blur voices, muffled, silverware, distant. He picked up the letter, ran his thumb along its edge. The handwriting on the front, his name, in her script was small and precise, just like her. He opened it slowly, carefully, like he might tear something if he rushed. "Dear Richard, you'll never read this, and maybe that's the only reason I can write it. There are things I can't say out loud, because once spoken, they become real, and I'm not sure I'm brave enough for that yet." His eyes moved down the page, each sentence like a thread pulled loose from the fabric of his own quiet longings. She wrote about the way he looked at her, the silences between them, the strange comfort she felt in his presence, even when nothing was said. She wrote about her fears, about timing, about the ache of wanting something she didn't believe she was allowed to want. And at the end, a single line, written darker than the rest, like she had pressed her pen just a bit harder when writing it. "And no, I never forgot my name. I just forgot how to stop feeling." Richard exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. The candle between them flickered again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the letter lay open on the table, no longer a secret, no longer a weight she had to carry alone. And in the quiet that followed, he realized something. Some confessions don't need to be spoken aloud to be heard. Some truths only need to be received. No calls, no emails, just silence and the memory of her smile. Richard had always thought of silence as a luxury in a world that shouted constantly through meetings, negotiations, deadlines. He had long since learned to treasure the quiet. It was, in many ways, the one thing he could control. But lately, silence had become something else entirely, because this silence wore the shape of Sarah's absence. 2 months had passed. He counted them in coffee cups, in unopened messages, in the echo of her heels that no longer passed his door. Langston Media still moved forward. Deals were signed, contracts executed. Success, as always, continued on schedule. But for Richard, the rhythm of work had become noise, empty noise, because the only person whose voice he strained to hear had gone quiet. Sarah hadn't said goodbye. Not really. She'd spoken softly, placed that folded letter on the table, and walked out into the cold evening with her coat slung over one shoulder, like she wasn't breaking someone open just by leaving. She still worked remotely, replied to team emails, sent reports, joined 2 video calls, always professional, always kind, but never personal, never him. And so he waited, not for a message, not even a sign, just a shift, something to say she still remembered, still thought of him, still cared, but nothing came. He hadn't reread the letter since that night. At first, he told himself he didn't need to, that he had memorized every line, that it was better kept closed safer, somehow. But lately, the silence had grown heavier, like a blanket in summer, smothering, not comforting. So one evening, when the office lights had dimmed and the city beyond the glass looked like a watercolor painting in rain, he stood from his desk and walked to the shelf. There, inside a planner he never used, was the letter, still folded, still untouched, until now. His fingers hesitated at the crease. The moment felt strangely sacred. This wasn't about reading her words again. It was about finally hearing them, not as a man in charge of a company, but as a man whose heart had been waiting for far too long. He opened the letter slowly. Her handwriting was neat, slanted, a little hurried near the end. He read each word carefully. This time, he didn't skim, didn't scan for subtext. He let the sentences land where they wanted. She wrote of their quiet moments, the way his eyes lingered, the way her heart raced. She wrote about her fears of timing, of vulnerability, of breaking something neither of them had dared name. I never forgot my name. I just forgot how to stop feeling. That line, it stayed in him like a pulse, because it wasn't poetic. It wasn't crafted for effect. It was raw. And he realized then he had done the same. He had kept feeling too, even when she left, even when she was silent. He had never stopped. He folded the letter back, carefully, set it on the desk, and stared at it like it might answer the ache blooming in his chest. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he walked the city streets in his coat, collar turned up, hands deep in his pockets. Denver was cold, but his thoughts burned hot. He passed the bookstore Sarah loved. It had a new display in the window, Second Chances. He almost laughed. Almost. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, told his assistant to clear his afternoon, then sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He searched for flights to New York. Earliest possible departure. One seat, no return date. He didn't know what he would say. Didn't know if she would open the door. Didn't even know if she'd want to see him. But love wasn't certainty. Love was choice. And today he chose her. He confirmed the booking, closed the laptop, and for the first time in weeks, the silence around him felt a little softer. Not because it had ended, but because he was finally ready to break it. Would you forget your name? For me. Every morning it wasn't where she expected to see him. Sarah had wandered into the bookstore on 72nd and Columbus like she always did on Fridays, hands cold from the wind, shoulders aching from another long week. She hadn't planned on staying long. Just a quick glance at the new arrivals. Maybe 10 minutes with a chai tea near the back window. Enough time to reset herself. Breathe. Pretend the ache inside her wasn't so loud. The bookstore had become her secret place. Quiet corners, soft lamps, no one asking anything of her, only shelves lined with stories she didn't have to finish. It was her version of safety. She was standing near the nonfiction section, flipping through a memoir about second chances, when she looked up and saw him. Richard. Standing there, near the poetry display. Gray coat, scarf, that familiar weight in his eyes. She blinked. For a moment, she thought she'd conjured him. Some projection of memory, brought to life by the loneliness she hadn't dared admit. But then he smiled. Not the practiced smile she'd seen him use in meetings, not the polite one he gave to clients. This one was different, wounded, real, quietly hopeful. He walked toward her slowly, as if not to startle her, and she couldn't move. She held the book against her chest, fingers pressing hard into the cover, trying to steady her breath. "Hi," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, or maybe just softer, like he hadn't spoken her name in too long. She nodded, lips parting slightly, but no sound came. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, neatly folded, and then, without a word, he knelt, right there, in the bookstore where she had spent so many mornings trying to forget him. Inside the handkerchief was a ring, simple, gold, timeless. Her breath caught in her throat. No one else in the shop seemed to notice, save for a couple seated in the reading nook, who looked up, then quickly looked away. He looked up at her, eyes steady now. "I don't want a secretary," he said quietly. "I don't want someone who organizes my calendar or catches my flight changes." She didn't blink, didn't breathe. "I want someone who makes me forget everything else," he continued. His voice trembled slightly. "Because I've been living without you these past 2 months, Sarah, and it was the loneliest success of my life." She shook her head slowly. "Richard." He held up a hand not to stop her, but to steady himself. "I don't expect anything. I don't even know if this is fair, but I flew here because I needed you to know. I meant every glance, every pause, every time I almost said something and didn't." He opened the handkerchief wider, and I remember the letter, every line. Then, softly, more tender than she'd ever heard him, "Would you forget your name?" For me, every morning the bookstore faded into a hush. All the ambient sounds, the rustle of pages, the clink of cups, the faint jazz from the cafe speakers blurred into something distant and unimportant. Only him. Only now. Sarah's hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of being seen. She lowered the book she'd been clutching, let it fall gently onto the nearby shelf. Then she knelt, too, right there, on the wooden floor, beside him. She reached out, not for the ring, but for his hand, laced her fingers through his. "Richard," she whispered, her voice breaking at the edges. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like. I don't even know what next week looks like." She smiled, though her eyes were wet. "But I know I missed you in every quiet moment, and I hated drinking coffee without someone to steal the foam from the top." He let out a breath, half laugh, half relief. She moved closer. "And I never really forgot my name," she said gently. "I just started remembering what it meant to feel again." She kissed him, not because it was romantic, not because it was expected, but because the only answer that felt true was something her mouth couldn't form into words. It was their first kiss, but it felt like coming home. His hand rested on her cheek. Her fingers curled against his collar. Outside, a bus rumbled by. Inside, the warmth of the bookstore wrapped around them like a blanket. No audience, no applause, just two people who had finally stopped hiding. When they pulled apart, she leaned her forehead against his. "I didn't think you'd come," she whispered. He smiled, brushing a curl behind her ear. "I didn't think I had a choice." The ring remained in the handkerchief, still waiting. There was time. This wasn't about rushing toward a ceremony. This was about choosing freely, fully, finally. He helped her stand. They walked to the cafe counter together, ordered tea, shared a cookie, and sat by the window where she always sat alone. Only now, she wasn't. Some stories end. Others begin with a kiss. For Sarah, The kiss in the bookstore had felt like the end of a very long chapter, the kind with torn pages, scribbled margins, and questions left unanswered. But as she and Richard stepped into the sunlight that morning, hand in hand, she realized it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something quieter, something steadier, something real. They returned to Denver together, not with grand announcements or sweeping changes, just with each other. She moved into the townhouse near City Park, where he had once lived alone for nearly a decade. Now, her scarf hung next to his coat. Her laughter echoed through the kitchen, and her tea mug sat on the counter, always half full and always just warm enough. She didn't go back to her old desk at Langston Media. There were no spreadsheets, no lunch orders, no secret glances across glass walls. Instead, she sat beside Richard at meetings, at fundraisers, and at the little breakfast table they shared every morning. Not as his secretary, but as the woman he had chosen, his partner. Richard changed too, not in ways most people could see, but Sarah noticed. He smiled more often, really smiled, the kind that reached his eyes. He took longer walks, read poetry aloud at night, even when he stumbled through the rhythm. And when she rested her head on his shoulder, he leaned in, soft, unguarded, like a man who no longer feared being known. 3 months after they moved in together, Olivia, Sarah's mother, passed away quietly in her sleep. It was spring. Cherry blossoms had just begun to bloom in New York. Sarah flew back for the service. Richard held her hand the entire time, spoke not as her boss, but as her family. And in the weeks that followed, when grief came like waves unexpected, unstoppable, he didn't try to fix it. He simply stayed. A month later, they founded the Olivia Grace Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at supporting caregivers of elderly parents, offering financial assistance, mental health counseling, and local support networks. Sarah poured herself into the work. It became her way of keeping her mother's love moving forward. Richard backed the foundation with quiet passion, using his influence not for praise, but for change. At the launch event, he stood beside Sarah as she spoke. Her voice cracked once, but only once, because she knew her mother would have been proud, not of the podium, not of the foundation, but of the woman Sarah had finally become. They settled into a rhythm, ordinary days, shared dinners, long drives with no destination. She learned that Richard hummed when he washed dishes. He learned that Sarah talked in her sleep, usually about cheese. They weren't perfect. There were late nights, disagreements over whether the towels should be folded in thirds or halves, a burned pie, a missed anniversary. But they always returned to each other, not because it was easy, but because it was home. One morning, nearly a year after the day in the bookstore, Sarah woke to the smell of toast and honey. She shuffled into the kitchen, wearing one of his shirts. The windows were open. Spring air floated in soft and golden. Birdsong in the trees, the soft clang of a spoon against a mug. Richard was already at the stove, humming something she didn't recognize. He turned when he heard her. His hair was messier than usual, glasses perched on his nose. And still he looked at her like she was the only page in the book he wanted to read. He stepped toward her, placed a kiss on her forehead. "Still forgetting your name," he whispered. She smiled, eyes soft, voice barely a breath. "Only when you look at me like that." Outside, the trees danced in the breeze. Inside, the kettle whistled gently. The world moved on. Cars honked, emails buzzed, people hurried to appointments. But in that kitchen, in that small, sunlit moment, time slowed. Because healing doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes with quiet mornings, warm mugs, and a voice that makes you feel safe again. They didn't need to say, "I love you" every day, because it was in the way he remembered how she took her tea, in the way she left sticky notes on his briefcase when he had long meetings. It was in the laughter they shared, the memories they honored, and the life they chose together. Sarah never forgot her name, but she did forget the pain. Not because it vanished, but because it was gently replaced with love, with purpose, with peace. And every day after, she woke to the sound of his voice, the warmth of his touch, and the quiet knowing that one small comment, said years ago with a half laugh, had changed everything. Sometimes, the things we try hardest to hide are the very things that deserve to be seen. Sarah spent years keeping her feelings quiet, afraid that revealing them would make everything fall apart. But it was the moment she was truly heard, without planning, without polish, that her life began to change.
This story reminds us that vulnerability is not weakness. It is courage in its most human form. To love someone without knowing if they'll love you back. To speak your truth even when your voice shakes. To let someone see you not the version you present to the world, but the one that aches quietly beneath the surface. As we grow older, we often learn to protect our hearts with silence. But love, connection, and healing begin when we dare to open the door even just a little. So if there's something you've been carrying for too long, maybe it's time to let it be seen. Because sometimes the softest truths are the ones that change everything. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, we'd be so grateful if you could like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to life, stories that heal, connect, and remind us we're never alone. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and of the hearts you love.